Now the lessons to be learnt there are being ignored. And nobody is willing to face up to the fact that the man in charge has to be killed dead as soon as the man in charge isn't in charge anymore. I mean, we don't care. But the old English wouldn't do that. They've killed nearly every second one of their kings, and they're probably the best country in the world today. Most of the early kings we don't know much about. Most of them couldn't read or write, but it didn't matter. Basically, when the Saxons took over England, they found a hard-working people and a productive country. They just needed to organise themselves in an efficient way so they could extract the wealth of these hard workers. These Saxons worked well together. And in 774 they had the idea of the King of England. And this worked well, but when his son tried to take over, it didn't work anymore. So they killed him after a few weeks. After another 30 years they tried it again. But this time, when he came back from a pilgrimage to Rome, they were about to kill him, but the king just handed over his throne instead. We don't know much about it, but 5 sons in a row took the throne, and they were all dead within a few years. When the last brother died, they handed the throne over to his son. And then his son took over, but he only lived for 16 days. At this stage they decided that the King of England was a good idea, so they replaced him. Then his brother was killed in a battle. Then his brother took over, but he was murdered. Then another brother took over for a good while, and they liked him, but he didn't have any children, so they gave the throne to his nephew instead. This nephew was very nervous because of all the other nieces and nephews and cousins that could replace him. So he gave out more gifts than any other king in Europe before him. But they just thought he was weak, so they killed him after a few weeks and replaced him with his brother. They then made his 2 children have a fight over who should succeed him. The eldest son won, but they killed him anyway after 3 years and replaced him with his brother. He was killed by a Viking though, who married his wife and made himself King of England. He did well, and his 2 sons took over, but they both died on the throne, so his stepson became king instead. His stepson was the son of his wife and the previous King of England, who was killed by a Viking. They liked him because he wasn't a Viking, but then he married a Viking. When he died, his brother-in-law, who was a Viking, took over, but he was killed by a cousin of the previous king who came over from France. This guy did a good job, and his son was allowed to take over, but not his eldest son. His 4th son was the one that was picked, but he was killed in a battle before he was married. Then another brother died of food poisoning, but his son wasn't allowed to take over. They gave it to his nephew instead. But then they didn't want him after a few years either, and they only let him reign so long as he didn't pass the throne on to his sons. There was a lot of fighting when he died, and his first cousin's son became king. They then made his eldest son try to kill his own father to get the throne, but he failed, and his brother became king instead. This king spent most of his time abroad, so they replaced him while he was away with his younger brother. But this king didn't work out either, so they poisoned him, and one of his poisoners took charge of the country until the king's son was old enough to be tested out. This king was also bad, and they locked him up until his son was old enough to be tested out. This king did a good job and managed to take over Scotland, but his son was a dandy and they didn't want him, so his wife and her partner forced him to hand the throne over to his son, who probably wasn't his son, but his wife's partner's son. This was fine, and his son took over, but he was no good, so they killed him, and his cousin became king, and his son fine, and then his son, but then his son wasn't any good, so they executed him and replaced him with his cousin. When he died, they killed his 2 children, and his brother became king. He didn't last long though, and a distant cousin was brought over from France and killed him in a battle. He did a good job, and his son too, who gave the throne to his grandniece, but they didn't want her, they wanted his daughter instead. So they killed her after 9 days in the job. Then her sister took the throne. Then her cousin came down from Scotland and became king. His father had been murdered, and his mother had died in an English prison, but he remained on friendly terms. But his son wasn't liked at all. He got in trouble and had his head cut off by Oliver Cromwell. After that, they never again had a King of England, and they did okay. They took over 1/5 of the world, and they called themselves Great Britain. Okay. We'll have an interval now for about 5 minutes.